Okay, so I'm from the Melbourne Blender Society. So this is where you can see we've had a number of events over the years. We've been going for quite a few years now. So we actually have a meeting this Thursday coming up. So hopefully we get a whole bunch of people along, because unfortunately we don't meet on a Saturday night. But anyway, so that's a little bit about where we are. So if you're in Melbourne, check out our website, and it'd be great to see you there. So now what I'm going to talk about today is how we created this. So a big shout out to Matthias in Amsterdam, who actually basically the pair of us did it together, but he did the original logo, which was fantastic, and the big block particle at the end, which was also brilliant. So this was our first concept. So we actually decided that what we were going to do is it was going to be a news promo. I don't know if you've seen those BBC ones with the sort of like the pinging sounds, but it was just going to be really kind of news promo-y in style. So we had a few elements. We had these red sort of background elements, these blue dots, as you can see, and the idea was that as we went past a city, that we would bring up one of the landmarks of that city. And we were going to try and do it as a point density kind of thing. So it would appear and then it would basically sort of disperse. And as it would go through, all of the blue dots would come together, and then they would zoom around the screen, and it would then go to the World Blender Meetup Day. So as you can see, so that was the original concept that Matthias came up with. Okay, so the first thing we did is that after we'd come up with the concept, or Matthias had come up with the concept, is we said, well, we need to work out how we're going to work together. So we set everything up in GitHub to begin with. So you can see there's been a whole series of changes. You can see the history, there you are, of how we have worked on the project. So we actually started with a bunch of experiments. And I'll run through a couple of those experiments here. So to start with, we tried looking at how we're going to dissolve the different landmarks. And this was the first experiment we had here. That was using explode modifier. Then we rendered in cycles using a particle system. And you can see one of the problems here is that there's little gaps everywhere because it's not actually a solid object. What it is a whole bunch of particles, little spheres, basically, that are filling the volume of the letters, but that means there's still gaps. So it really didn't work. It did okay, because there's things you can do with particles that are less easy to do, such as this. With the explode modifier. So here we're actually changing the color of the particle based on its age. So the older it gets, the more it moves towards a lighter color, as you can see, and it should fade out just by the end of it. So, and we'll just go back to the start. So that was our point cloud experiments. So we started trying to work out how to do this. And if you're interested in learning more about this particular one, then go to Blender Diplom here, this tutorial, dissolve your logo in Blender 2.6. This was basically how I built the first version of it. And it covers, it steps you through all the different steps to get this kind of an effect. It's a little bit involved. It does involve, in the end, I had stuff that was set up in Blender Internal to get the turbulence for the actual particles, while we were rendering it in cycles. So it gets a little bit tricky if you go with the full particle approach as opposed to the explode approach, which is what's used here. But the principles are very similar. So that's a really good, if you want to get that effect, have a look there. So the next thing, if you remember, we had these, we had the blue dots, and we had how they were going to float around in the background and how we were going to make the cities names follow the dots and so on. So you can see this was our first attempt at, or correction, this was my first attempt at trying to get all of the blocks to move in the way we wanted them to. At the same time, also getting this text to actually follow a specific vertex on the sphere. And we use two techniques for this. The first is the sphere itself is using what's called dupliverts, which is quite it's one of those sort of arcane, it's been around for many, many, many years, but not everybody knows about it. And so what we did is, and I'll do a quick demonstration of how that works. So you have something like this object here, which is the classic cube, and we'll add another object. Actually, let's add monkeys, because everybody has monkeys. We'll just scale it down a little bit. We'll stick it up there so you can see it. So you can see the front. And what you do is you select the object that you want to have duplicated on each vertex of the object and parent it. So first we do the parent, then we take this object and we go to an option down here called duplication, and we choose vertexes. And now you can see that we have all of these monkeys, and the monkeys actually replicate the vertex. So if I move a vertex here, you'll see that monkey moves. So, and there's you can also do rotation as well. So that way they actually look in. And depending on what you are rendering, so you'll see that certain objects render and certain objects don't. Your actual parent object does not render in this case. It's only the monkey objects that render. The other thing is that if I remember correctly, I think you have to have the actual monkey object on the same layer. If you move it to a different layer, it breaks the duplication as well. So there's as you can see there. So there's a couple of things you need to be a little bit careful of. But that's how we did this first sort of ball duplication. And to get the messiness back here, what I did is I actually just put a displace modifier on it. So it basically just messed up. Put a displace, used I think just clouds, and then just put the value out to like 5 or 6 or something like that. So it was really, really moving everything around. The other thing is just around how we got the actual text to follow a specific vertice. So this way it was, it could track it basically instead of trying to parent it. As you can see, as this rotates, it still actually follows the location. So to do that, what I did is, so we'll just add some text quickly. There we are. So to make it actually follow a specific vertex, what I did is that in here, I have my vertex again. So what we did is we created, got to move Zoom's window because it's right over where the vertex group is. So we'll call this the Hash World Blender Meetup Day vertex group. We'll assign that vertex. Then what we do is we take the actual text object and put a constraint on it, and we put a copy location constraint. So we choose the cube, and then you can choose a vertex group. And so now you can actually see that it is that specific group. So if I go here and again edit this and move it, you can see the text actually follows where the vertex is. So that way you can effectively bind it to a specific vertex. And you can see as it actually rotates around as well, that it keeps it's only copying the location. So it's not actually, it's not going to change the direction of the text as such. That gives you an idea of how we got these to actually track the various vertices as they were moving around. So that was kind of our very first sort of like experiments. Now I got one more. Yeah, we might just go zoom through that. And so then we actually started working on the edit. The music is from Kevin MacLeod from Incomplete Tech. So it's a CC BY. So that way, if you wanted to pick it up, it's called, I'm pretty sure it's called WEPA, W-E-P-A. So it's a sort of like a funky kind of news intro. But as you can see, it was just, again, we would take it very early days and we were basically just looking at how we're going to make the actual world appear. And we used a set of globes from a gentleman off Blend Swap. I think his name is Leon. And so his was they're awesome globes. They're fantastic. I've used them last year and this year. So I'd highly recommend them. So now because we're using GitHub, I don't actually have the early versions of my logos anymore. I only have the latest version here. So you'll see that the actual structure is a little bit complex and messy because we're working in a team across both. Matthias is based in Amsterdam, and I'm based here in Melbourne. So again, opposite sides of the world, different time zones. Luckily, I was up quite late, so was he at times. So we had a fair bit of overlap. And we actually used Discord, which is a tool that Matthias really likes, and we use this basically as chat. I believe it's actually a game. It's meant to be sort of like a gaming chat thing. That's why you can see I'm currently playing Blender. So, but you can. It was very useful for sort of like an IM client. You could just paste images, as you can see there. And it worked really well. It does actually support audio, and we did have a couple of conversations, so that was really good. But you can see if I go back, let me just turn that off. Turn off auto keying. If I go back to this layer, and then just so you can see this wire here. This is the wireframe. At the moment, I've got the dots turned off, for a reason I'll explain a little bit later. Here, if we'll zoom in. So you can see, if I go to the modifiers, now these modifiers actually, so in the actual globe one, if you use these, they will actually make the thing turn into a globe. So it takes a flat, which is really awesome. So originally the plan was I'd actually take that and just morph that into a globe. And unfortunately, they didn't quite meet Matthias's. Matthias was doing the artistic direction and didn't quite meet what he wanted. So he went off and did something that you'll see in a little bit. But it's a very, and again, this is in a blend swap file. I'll see if I can find that afterwards, and I'll tweet the address for it as well. And the cast between the two of them, so if we put this to a factor of 1 and 1, you get a lovely round world. But in the end, we didn't use them. So I can probably turn them off for the rest of this demonstration. So, but if you wanted to, you could get that sort of like nice world going from flat to curved. But what we did have is obviously this wireframe. Wait a second. I've got it turned off at the moment as well. So you can see that when we have the wireframe set up, you can see exactly how it actually puts everything together. And if I make that a bit thicker, other way, you can see how it works there. But in the end, we played a fair bit with the thickness, and you'll see a variation in the actual different items. The other thing that is we also had all of the different countries. So let me just turn that one on again. So we sprinkled them around the world, and you can see them here. But what we did is that I would do basically one version. So in the first, it was just the wireframe. So that was the first version that we did. I'll just skip to the end. And then we would iterate. So we were doing a lot of iteration this iteration, this is the next version. I added the actual text in. I added the fade up, the fade down for all the different locations, and added these dots as well. So this was the next version. So this was using the dupliverts concept that I explained just beforehand. So you can see here we have the actual, so each of these different maps, we had two different maps. We had one mesh for the wireframe. We had another mesh for the dupliverts. And you can see where we had this is the dot cube here that is actually the one being duplicated. There is actually a third one here that was, in the end, I didn't use. I could probably delete that one. But you get the idea. So we steadily kept building. So we built on, okay, let's put the vertexes on. So that was how we got to the vertexes. And we moved on to the next version. So this version, what we did is, for a starter, I was doing everything in Blender internal, so it rendered nice and quick. But the motion blur that I was getting out of the vector node, because the camera movement is so quick, it was really horrible. So to get a really nice motion blur, I changed over to cycles. So you can see, and this stage, I also changed the material, the color, because we started playing with the color look and the colors of it as well, since we were now kind of getting to the point where we actually had something that was starting to work as far as those other elements go. And to do the fade ups and the fade downs, each of these materials, so you'll see here, we have text Brisbane, and you'll see that I've actually got a keyframe on this, and you can see it appear at the bottom there, on the material. So I've actually keyframed each of the materials. So you can see that basically it starts at 0, goes up to 1, fades up. You can see it there. I won't turn it on to rendered because my machine's not that powerful, so it'll just kill everything. But you get the idea. So it's basically, it starts at 0, fades up, then it fades back down to 0. And it basically mixes it with a transparent BSDF. So that way, when it's 1, it's pure red. When it's not, it's basically transparent and invisible, effectively. So that was that version. So we're sort of moving along. By the way, that's the music credit there. So, and we move to the next version. So next version. Now you can hear, the first thing you probably notice is the music's changed. So Matthias decided he was going to create some music based on some ideas he had. And so now we basically had a version. So this version, as we kept developing, you can see we sort of keep building and then building and then building. We swapped out the old music for the new music. And at this stage, we also added in these little dots. So the dots are quite simple. So the ping here is a shape key animation. So you can see it's very simple as far as a shape key animation goes, and all it. So you can see as actually it won't work. That won't work. You can see all it is basically a couple of rings, and as I change the value to the value, it basically plays the animation. So that's the 1 position. And then back the other way is the 0 position. So it's pretty simple. What I did is I appended that. Once I'd finished with this, I appended it into our main file. And I'll select one. And what I did is that you can see how it just basically, I just duplicated each of the, you can see how I just duplicated the frame. So it just kept playing the frame over and over and over and over again. And then again, because what I wanted to do is to match the same fade up, fade down as the lettering, is that we again created a separate ping for each one. Now, some of you might be saying, surely there must have been a better way of doing that, but I couldn't find a way to make it each one fade up and down individually without creating its own material. So they share the material. As you can see here, the orange ping for Brisbane will have the same material as the orange for Brisbane as well. So yeah, basically they share the same material, so they have the same timing. So that's how we did the pings. We've got the music. I added a little bit of thickness to the text for Melbourne, you might have noticed as well. So it pretty much goes on. I'm not sure if we've... yes, this is one of the earlier versions where when you get to the end, we did the transition to the new logo. So this was just a pure GL render. This was the first one. So it's very rough. It was just done quickly to make sure that we could see, because one of the major problems we actually had was this sequence here. So if you remember the original drawings, the idea was we would go from all the blue dots would come together and then they would sort of zoom around the screen and then come into the world at the center. Off to one side. Now, this is where we got into real trouble. We had to work out some way we could either just pull these completely out of shot, but that kind of didn't work because we had these other objects coming in and sort of flying around, and just a straight transition was okay, but it really didn't quite meet what the original vision was. So I started trying to fix this in this one file so that we could actually have all the particles move around and in. And that was, I learned a lot about keyed particle systems in the last week, and I've actually got one here. So, which can show you how keyed particles work. Hopefully it'll show you how it works. So they're quite cool when they do work, but the idea is that you tell a particle system to use other particle systems for the behavior from like a start and an end position. Well, the idea was that I started trying to integrate all the elements into this one file. And to be honest, it was a real nightmare. So here we can, I'll just turn these off. Actually, I'll turn that one off. So we have two systems here. We have two particle systems, and actually I'll just free that bake because that's another great gotcha in Blender, is forgetting to free the bake. But we still have a bake somewhere. This was when I was experimenting. Free all bakes. There we are. Okay, now we're back to normal. So I have an origin system here, so particle settings.origin, and we have another system here, which is the particle settings.target. So the idea is that any particles generated from here will move from this system to that system. And what I'll do, I'll just change one parameter because that was something that I was experimenting with before. And if it works properly, everything, where have I got? I've got gravity on. So it's not doing what it's supposed to do. I gotta love it. Love it, love it, love it. This is where you start getting yourself into real trouble around this, because there is another. So you'll see there is, let me just select that one. There's three particle systems, and I'll actually turn these ones off. So the first particle system is causing everything to explode outwards. So if I just turn on the origin one and turn that one off, turn that one on. So this is what this particle system is doing. So it's exploding. This particle system is doing nothing. It's just sitting there. And that's probably because, oh no, it's got Newtonian. It's got them turned on. So it's not doing anything. So what happens is that your keyed system, which is this one, now actually creates, so if I actually look, where is it? Remember, you've got to have the right one selected because you end up with so many particle systems. You can see it starts with this cube origin particle system and it moves to a cube target particle system. And you can control how it moves through time and duration and other bits and pieces. But if I play it, now hopefully what it should do, fingers crossed, is that it should explode and then move to the second system and just stop, because that's the behavior of the second system while the first system was exploding. Okay, here we go. Let me just set it back to start. Yeah, it did it. So, and I think, let me just try something. This is an experiment. No, didn't work. Because that actually tells you how long it will hold that system before it starts. But you get the idea if I just go back to level 20. So it's gone, it's basically started, the first particle system gone out. The second particle system is solid, so it blends between the two. Now, I haven't found a way yet that I know of to be able to control the transition from one frame to another via a curve. So I don't think you can do that at the moment. You can use these to try and control it a little bit. Duration will hold. So if I put in the first system, it's already holding for a duration of 10. If I put that down to 0, it should move pretty much straight away. What I'll do is I'll just change that to 30 so we don't have to wait quite as, that one. So I don't have to wait quite as long. So yeah, it's going out straight away. If I set that to 15, which is pretty much the whole thing, it does this. It's doing something different. You'll see how because it had an initial velocity, it's holding that initial velocity longer and then coming in the last 5 frames. So, well, if I change it to 0 again, it'll start taking the impact very quickly, and so it's only going out a little bit like that. So that's how duration works. And that's my value add for today, because I couldn't find any documentation anywhere on how duration works. I found it for time, but not duration. So there's also a gotcha for time as well. This is time starting from the first frame of this system. So for a lot of demos, people set stuff up on frame 0 or frame 1. Which is fantastic because then it runs really well and they have simple examples like this. The problem is if you start your particle system on frame 682, like we did, suddenly it's unclear what this means. If you type in 682, it means, well, it actually doesn't start till 682 frames, or sorry, if you put 682 into this one, it'll actually start 682 frames after the first particle system starts, not that it is, correction, it'll achieve that target 682 frames later, as opposed to a few of the documentation which implied that it actually would be on frame 682. So I got burnt a few times there. So that's my understanding of how it works. And if you start playing around with these systems, they're great. They work really well when you can get them to work. It's very easy to end up doing something silly like this, like having the wrong thing showing, and you're going, wait a second, that's not what I've designed. Why isn't it working? So, and especially when you change settings, and you've got to make sure the settings stay pretty much the same between the targets and origin. You can do some variation, but I wouldn't recommend it. To actually set it up the way I did it originally is that I created the first one, then I went across to the target one, I said, give me the origin, then I said, create a new one, and I called it so that way I knew that the second particle system was absolutely identical to the first particle system. The problem is that once you create a new copy of it, if you change the first one, you've got to make sure you change the second one. So this was giving me a nightmare. I could not get it to work. I was trying to get everything to come through the background and come around, and it was just a nightmare. It was not working at all. So in the end, we eventually agreed we're going to do something else. So what I did was that we have these dupliverts here, is that you'll notice that at a certain point, they start moving. And to get that effect, what I did is I actually replaced the dupliverts with a particle system. So a particle system where a cube, the same cube, was generated on each of the vertices of the system. So that way, they could actually kind of have a little bit of motion, and they wouldn't look quite as out of place. So that was sort of like that piece. And that was a nightmare. I think there was a couple of nights where I was just literally tearing what's left of my hair out. And it was yes, a very painful time. But we got there. In the end, we just said, look, we're just going to do a crossfade, and that's just the way it's going to have to be. So on to the next version. So version 6. So this version, so last couple of nights, I've been working till about midnight with Matthias on this phase, is that we have, one of the things was we had a very, if you look back, we go back, you'll notice it's very flat. It's like very flat on the screen. And I wanted something a little bit different to that. So I changed I actually did this morning. I changed the camera angle so that we would have, and actually move the camera in so we could have a little bit more sort of like depth to it, a little bit more depth. We changed the color scheme to make it match more the final render color scheme of the actual blocks. I also obviously can see it's red now rather than orange. And it was starting to advance on. So we're getting close. This was getting close to final. We might just jump ahead. So now you can see, if we go from here, you can start seeing the how we did the particle systems. So now you can see these are the old particles here that are floating around. So if I come back a little bit, so you can see what we did is I faded the wireframe down the same way, we did any other material fade. We did the fade in the renderer. So the particle system, I scaled up the cubes. We've already changed their colors so that they get a bit bigger. So they basically match the cube size a little bit better. The other thing is that this morning I also added a new turbulence force field. So you might have noticed beforehand, it looked like basically the map of Alaska was moving across the screen. So I changed it to get a turbulent field in there as well, so they get messed up a bit more. And that way they get mixed in with the background, with the transition becomes less obvious. So this was pretty much where it was at. About 8 or 9 o'clock this morning. So at this stage we had rendered. We'd done a lot of rendering. Obviously there's a lot of test rendering, but we actually did this part of it on Sheepit yesterday. So we used the Sheepit renderer to do this part of it. We did do a couple of tests in Sheepit. So I think the version before was done in Sheepit. But I really wanted to fix those last few things today. So today I threw it on Render Street, those bits, and thanks to the guys there, that worked brilliantly. And also Sheepit worked brilliantly, and thanks to everyone who helped out there. We have a team, WBMD. So if you want to join the World Blender Meetup Day Sheepit rendering team, you're more than welcome. Please come along. We might not need you for another year, but hey, doesn't hurt. So we got to the point where we were trying to do the final renders. And the other thing was that so we've got pretty much that was it. Let me just shut that one down. And we had the actual where we put together where are we? Scenes. We actually had to put the edit together. So the edit is here. So you can see these are the different components of the render here, of the edit here. So that's another good tip, by the way, is that if you want to turn on audio scrubbing, it's actually in probably one of the least obvious places. It's actually in the timeline playback if you want to get your audio scrubbing on. It's not an obvious spot where it's stored. So here you can see we've got a couple of... Now, I'm guessing, and somebody else can confirm, that this sound effect, I'll just mute these, I reckon this is Ton.
I've got a link for everybody watching too, and if you're seeing this in the future, on our YouTube page, we now have the video too, so you can watch it. But yeah, that does sound like Ton.
For those who didn't know, I just use what's called the preview feature here as well. You can actually set a preview range rather than a full range, so you can restrict what you're using there. I did a video a couple of years ago on the Blender training website on how to use the preview feature. So if you're interested, you can go have a look at there. So what we have now is you can see the different outputs. I'll just hide that. So when we rendered this wireframe, we made a decision very early on to render it with a transparent background. And the idea was that then what we could do is that we could play with the color that we wanted to actually put in behind it. So if we decided that we wanted to have something, we could have hot pink if we wanted to. Whatever we felt was right. And in the end, the color we actually chose, this color is sort of like a very neutral color that was very similar to some of the colors used in the final, this part here. So you can see these sort of colors over here, a little bit lighter. So the idea was that we had some matching between the two. But what we actually decided in the end is, and it was literally a last-minute thing, I think I decided this at about 2 o'clock this afternoon, is we took this frame here, or one of these frames, cleared out all the objects, and then just rendered the straight background here, which is just a background frame. So that way, when it dropped in, we'd have, let me just turn that one off. We'd have, again, a little bit more depth, a little bit more color variation, a little bit more, just sort of, makes it a little bit better, and keeps it consistent between the two parts, because we were wrestling a lot around keeping them artistically consistent. And Matthias had to keep me on point for that one because I was going off on other tangents. So that was how we put in the background. We had the wireframe. And then just to do the transition here, is you can, if we go back to the start of the transition, so you can see these are the blocks from Alaska being all messed up by the turbulence field. There's a Gaussian blur on the frames that are coming in, which is these frames here. And that's then just keyed here. So you can see they're keyed up and down, so that we actually key up the Gaussian blur. So to make it, from making it invisible to visible, making the frame visible, and taking the Gaussian blur from big to low. So it basically turns off by the time you get to the end here. So, and that's pretty much it. So then it was just a matter of outputting it. To do that, you can see our render presets over here. I just used Xvid and AVI H.264. I did have the lossless output check, but that generated like a 400 meg file. So we got rid of that. And the bit rate's actually pretty low from what I can see. Matthias and I had a bit of a conversation about that, but he came to the conclusion that this was an acceptable bit rate. I generally tend to run higher bit rates when I run it into Vimeo, does it make any difference? It's probably not that noticeable for anybody except me. So these in the end, these worked fine for Vimeo. And that was about it. So any questions?
Yeah. What was your experience of Sheepit, and what are some things that you think now that you know, because you use both Sheepit and another one, if I remember, right? You use two different cloud rendering things. But,
yeah,
what were your experience?
I used Render Street. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, this is the Sheepit render farm. So it is a shared render farm. So it's a free service, basically. So the idea is that everybody, you can put your project up on the render farm, as you can see here, and then other people will donate their machines to render for it. So if we go to the status screen, so you can see all the different projects. So you can see there's one I rendered there, there's one I rendered there. So we go to the status screen, you can actually see how many projects are on the go at the moment. So at the moment, they've got 555,000 frames in the queue, 61 projects, 395 machines basically processing. So they're generating about 3,500 frames per hour. And you can see the count just keeps going up and up and up. Excuse me. So it's actually got to a point where it's quite mature, it's quite stable. There are still a few challenges around using it. I think James talked about it beforehand, how you actually have to pack and upload your entire project. So you need to be a little bit careful about losing stuff. We found on one of our test renders that we lost the font because so it reverted back to the Blender font. But once we had that going, it was all working pretty well. The only thing is it works off a credit scheme. So you'll see that if I go to my account, you'll see that I have 286,267 points, and you can see how they're calculated. So if you render a frame for somebody else, you get given points. If you get a whole bunch of other people to render your frames, you get points taken away. You can go negative. I think Matthias is on about negative 3,500 at the moment. So the idea is, and the points are important when it comes to actually determining the order in which the projects are rendered. So if I go to this one and actually try adding a project, you'll see that based on my current points, I will be 9th in the queue. So that means that I'll put my job on and it will sit there with either a waiting or maybe one or two, because if you've got your own machines on, your own machines will render your own project. Your own team will render your own project as long as they have that checkbox checked. So that you can actually see the progress. You can see big blocks of like 100 machines rolling through these different projects. So, or certainly the other day they were, and they would pick up the top one and then they all basically jump on it and render it. So if we just, where are we?
I've also got a request from Matthias.
Yeah.
He's asking if you can go through the various Vimeo iterations of the globe part. He thinks that would be pretty cool to show. And you've got the time, by the way. You're the last presenter before the video replays. So, if you want to check some of those out, you can.
Okay. That might be interesting, Matthias, because I'm not sure how. I'll see what I can find, because I didn't actually render a lot on my machine. Oh, wait a second. No, you sent me a whole bunch of links. Yes. Okay. Let me see what I can find. I'll get to that in a moment. So these are the. You can see that like this one's clearly the one that's getting the most love at the moment, while the other ones are sort of shared around. This one's getting a fair bit of love here as well. So, when we were watching it on Friday, there was like a block of about 100 and 120 machines. So for an hour or two, we were sitting on 2 machines or 3 machines, and then suddenly it peaked at about 150 or thereabouts. So they do basically, as long as you keep your rating up, it doesn't delay it that long. So I threw a version on last night of this, the first half of the globe, and that took about 3 hours to render. The second option is to go to Render Street, which is a paid render arrangement. And with that, I'll just fire up Blender again. Okay, so you can see with Render Street, again, it's it's actually a commercial render farm, and they have an add-in that actually sits in this, and it's just been updated for the latest version, 2.77, 2.78. And all you need to do, if you want to send a frame to it, you just hit render. It will upload it to their servers, and I won't do it now because it takes a little while, and this is a big file, and yada, yada, yada. So, and then you can basically just go to the actual page, and you can see the progress. And the progress is quite good. So here you can actually see Render Street. And so this was, I actually had to, so this is actually the final wireframe rendering. It took 49 minutes to do the whole thing. It took about, as I mentioned, on Sheepit, it took about 3 hours. It cost me $32 US compared to free. So, you know, obviously because I needed it quickly, I was willing to pay, and I think it made a lot of difference to it. So that's what basically, and again, and all I did was I'd press the add-on button and it went up and it worked fine. There was absolutely no problem. The download speed, the other thing was the actual download speed. For Sheepit, it took nearly an hour to download the frames. From Render Street, it took 5 minutes. So because, again, Sheepit's voluntary, the guy who's running it, who's doing a fantastic job running it, obviously he's got to keep costs down. He's got advertising to try and defray some of the cost, but clearly, you know, bandwidth and storage and so on are not free. So I imagine that's probably why they throttle it, I would expect. While I'm doing that, David, any other questions I can just answer on the fly?
Sure. One thing that there's no big questions on the stream right now. At one point you had over 50 people watching this, so no pressure at all. But one thing I wanted to know is that, is Sheepit like a good way to just kind of test out cloud rendering if you want to get your feet wet, and before you kind of commit some like real dollars to when you actually want to use it on, say the more, when you ever pay for rendering, etc. Like, is it pretty easy to set up, etc., the Sheepit and all of that?
It certainly is. If you want to render, if you want to put into render, yeah, it's very, very easy to put stuff in. Thank you, Matthias. So yeah, I think Sheepit is a great place to start of what it's like to use a renderer, like an online renderer. It's also really easy to get set up to actually put your computer in to help render other people, help render with other people. And obviously, if you help render other people, then you're likely to get machines faster when you want to render. So
you definitely recommend maybe just running Sheepit now to just kind of build up some of these credits before.
Yeah, I've had my other machine running sort of like for the last week to basically just do that. Here's the first one. You can see this again, very rough render. So it was all low poly. But Matthias did a fantastic job on it, and it just gave you the idea of how it all sort of like originally came together. So that was the first cut of it. And again, just proof of concept, low poly, so that we could get it up and running as quickly as possible. So let's have a look at the second one. So it is actually intentionally blank at this stage, because the idea was that we would put the other globe render in, so it was left blank intentionally. We should put that up. Left blank intentionally. But we should there we are. Yes, we've learned quite a few bits and pieces through the process, and it's been I think we're Well, Matthias can answer for himself, but I think we managed to not kill each other to the point where we're willing to do it again next year.
Good. So. I was just going to say, we're going to do this again. So, awesome.
So I might put a wrap on there. If you've got any, basically Melbourne Blender Society, if you've got questions, shoot me a question through there, or talk to David. David can kick them to me, so we can work out. Matthias, I'm sorry the internet's not behaving. Maybe you can show it as part, because Matthias is doing a talk later this afternoon or tomorrow or wherever it is in your time in the world, and get him to maybe he can show them as well. That would be great.
If you want to say a few parting words or hello or anything, but you've done well, man. Just want to give you the floor for a few minutes.
But I'd just like to say thank you very much, David and Sterling and all the other guys who get to experience what it's like for me, because it's middle of the night there for you, David, now.
Yeah, 6 a.m. The sun's going to go up here.
Yeah. Again, thanks for organising everything. It's been great, and hopefully we'll go on to bigger and better things again next year. So thanks again. Thanks to Matthias as well. I'm just in the process of posting Twitter links to stuff to do with my presentation, and I'll put Matthias's Vimeo links in there as well, so you can see them all. Thanks very much, and over and out from Australia.